All right, we have a treat for you tonight. We have Dr. Michelle DuBois, who's the Gifted and Talented Coordinator for the Boulder Valley School District. And we have Dr. Robin Greene, who's the Director of Gifted and Talented Education and Nursing Services for Denver Public Schools. And they're both co-authoring a book that is coming out soon, and they'll share that with you during their presentation. The title of their presentation tonight is Latinx Gifted Learners, a Culturally Responsive Approach for Identification and Programming. So please welcome Dr. Robin Greene and Dr. Michelle DuBois.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for having us here today. We are so excited to be here and to be able to share our content. This is one of our passion areas that Rob and I have been working on for many years, and really excited about being able to share this with you.
And I'm pulling this up, and can you guys see it okay? Of course, just when I thought I had all of the screen sharing down, give me just 1 second.
Well, while you're doing that, Robin, I'll go on and talk about why my journey started and where I am. Does that work?
That works for me.
Okay. All right. So my journey started back when I was a young child. My parents are immigrants. They're actually second generation U.S. citizens, but their families come from Spain and from Mexico. So growing up, they were migrant workers, and eventually my mom did get her GED when she was about 40. My dad never did, but he was a very gifted engineer with all kinds of construction skills and plumbing, electrical, he did all that. So, but I found out in my journey is that once I started in Title I school working about 20 years ago, and started with my gifted endorsement, I realized how lucky and how fortunate I was as a young child to be able to really promoted by my family. My parents were really very much into education because they only had 8th grade educations at the time. And so I really started looking around at kids who were like me and really wanting to be able to find pathways for these children to be identified and programmed for.
And I'm Dr. Robin Greene. I'm excited to be here tonight and very grateful to CAGT for having both Michelle and I. You know, our conversation tonight is going to be around Latinx as a broader population learners. And specifically, when I think about my journey with this work and my why, you know, I've been working with gifted students for about 20 years and their families. And some of our most vulnerable students, be they our Latinx learners, be they our African American learners or our indigenous populations, I would find, as many of you have found, didn't have their voice represented. And several things happened in my life that caused me to want to work with very bright, brilliant second language learners, African American and Latinx learners. I have come from Texas. I've been here now for 10 years in Colorado. And some of those early years teaching and the connections that I made with those families have shaped really my future, my direction. And when I think about this work and the importance of it, I owe a lot of it to them. And so Michelle and I have quite a few roads that have taken us both personally and professionally into this work. You know, I also saw when I was younger that there were students who were in my high school who were Latinx, who would call out and talk to a teacher, but the teacher wouldn't give them the time of day. And I couldn't understand that. It used to frustrate me so much. And that's really where my social justice kicked in. And so identifying English language learners and Latinx learners, simply put, it's about creating equitable access, opportunities around equitable access for identification and programming to support how these really incredible people think differently, both academically, how they engage with the world, and the impact of their culture and the honoring of their culture. What we're really talking about today, what Michelle and I want to engage with you in, is about adaptive change, and sharing with you this notion that by taking a critical eye at our systems and structures that oppress our Latinx population, as well as our students of color, we can make a difference.
So who are Latinx learners? If you're not familiar with the term Latinx, Latinx is gender neutral, which is why we chose to use that term in this presentation, also in our book. So Latinx learners, they come from 33 countries. So it's not just from Mexico, it's not just from Colombia, it's from 33 different countries, Venezuela. So there's just a lot of countries. So if you widen your perspective as you're looking at our Latinx learners, widen your perspective about who they are. The other thing too that we need to remember is that some of these families have been here for 3 generations in the US. So it could be that their parents were originally from, well, they're still from Mexico, but they came into our country and then they had their children here. So their children were US citizens. But it could be also that those children have other children. So then they're all having a second generation, right, of US citizens. So we need to look at those different types of cultural lenses as we're looking at how long a student may have been in this country. So Latinos are projected to represent 39% of the US population under the age of 5 by 2060. So that's increased since we looked at the 2010 data and the 2008 data. So we are increasing our population. And by 2050, Latinos are projected to be the majority culture in the US. Just this year at the University of California, the freshman class was 36% Latino, and that's the majority population of freshman class. So we do see an increase in our learners, and we should also be seeing an increase in identification. So we do know that there are issues in identification, which I'm sure that many of you are aware of. We've had little change over the last 20 or so years, and we've been working on trying to figure out how we can find our Latinx learners. So some of the areas of identification are state and local policies, also justice system. The system is institutionalized racism that our schools have created and systems have created. So also there is no national policy. Identification protocols are in many places not really looking at alternative identifications, which is what we talk about in our book, how we can look at different pathways for these students. And then also just the assumptions about what giftedness looks like. Giftedness does not have one lens, right? We need to be looking at all the cultural factors that impact giftedness. And also educators' perceptions about what Latinos are, who they are, and if they're not speaking English, does that make them not as easily identifiable as an English language learner or as an English learner? So, and also just understand about characteristics and what they look like in a cultural Latino kiddo, what they look like, and then access to advanced curriculum. We're not giving advanced curriculum if these students are not identified.
Well, it's like that chicken or the egg thing, right, Michelle, with like, do I give access to advanced curriculum, but the child hasn't been identified yet? Well, we know what the research says. If we give them access to the advanced curriculum and the supports, specifically if they're second language learners, with a culturally responsive lens, then we're going to find them.
Right, and we do talk a lot about that in our book about the talent pool and how we have talent development and how we need to expose these kids at early ages to advanced programming so that we can actually find these children. One size does not fit all. This really resonates with me because as I look at a body of evidence, as we're looking at criteria that we're developing data, trying to gather and collect, there is not one size. It's not going to be a cognitive that you're going to find these kiddos on. It's not going to be an achievement data. So you really have to build a large body of evidence and really look at those types of data you're collecting. So just know that you need to look at more than just one piece of data. And then also, so we're looking at Pascal's and Frazier's idea of casting a wider net. So that's what I'm talking about with the body of evidence. We need to be casting a huge net and really having all kinds of different resources that we can pull from. Now, Robin and I are not saying that you should test this kid infinitely, but what we're saying is that you do need to pull some of these pieces, and once you're more familiar with them and with your population, you'll know which pieces work best. We are actually have case scenarios and actually, excuse me, assessment information inside the book that we've written. And it goes through all those things and all the things that we found that have been really successful in finding our gifted Latinos. So the body of evidence, like I said, we need to have a wider body of evidence. We need to be looking at qualitative data, even much more in this case than quantitative data. So portfolios, interviews, community surveys, to know what these kids are doing outside of their actual school. Universal assessment, as you all know, is definitely a tool that if you're not using, you should be using in your district to universally assess kids. We do it at kinder and second grade with Denver Public Schools in Boulder Valley. And then rapid language acquisition. This is really a tool that we really started to use recently where we live, and that is looking at how fast a child gains rapid language acquisition. And that should be an indicator for giftedness.
And with that universal assessment, in Denver, we're also utilizing it in our 6th grade. And so we're really trying to capture students, and we try to capture them early in both Boulder Valley and Denver so that we can get them access to programming. However, that is one assessment, and that's the piece that just makes up a piece of the body of evidence. And your universal assessment doesn't have to be quantitative. It could be an observation tool. It could be follow-up interviews, although depending on your school district size, that might not be doable. You know, as part of the body of evidence and really having a robust, strong BOE, is we want to make sure that we have both normed and that we have both normed locally, nationally, and demographic group normed assessments. And in that, we want to make sure that we have culturally inclusive behavior checklists. We need to be careful, though, with our culturally behavior checklist. We need to make sure that it's research-based, that it doesn't fall into stereotypes, and that it sees the student's culture as strength and their linguistic diversity as a strength. With that, we know that sometimes those behavior checklists, if they are culturally inclusive, they may be mismatched from another type of observation scale that really looks at performance, demonstrated performance, versus that potential. And then also really thinking through demographic group norms. How do you look at, and this is something that we specifically do in Denver, but how do we look at each school? And then from there, let's look at who, we can set the number at the top 5%, the top 10%, but we look at within each demographic group where our learners fall. So if our Latinx population on an assessment we're using hits at the 93rd percentile versus the 95th, and then I look at the top 10% within that group, then I'm using those demographic group norms. Also looking for our outliers. So who within the school, from the universal assessment or from the classroom, is really just standing out positively or negatively. And so really that goes down into both culturally responsive identification practices and assessment. So question, how many of you are using culturally responsive assessments? I should hear some, like if I could hear you, I would think some of you are going, she's out of her mind. There's what? There's no such thing. And there aren't. There are culturally responsive assessments. There are culture fair tests, and it's really more important, not more important, it's equally important as to how we give the assessment. So we need to be culturally responsive in how we are assessing students. So we don't just go in the first time we've ever met a child and say, hi, I'm Mrs. Greene, come with me to this strange room and let's test. We wouldn't do that for any child. And so it's really talking about how do we build those relationships. And yes, there are ways to administer an assessment being culturally responsive. The biggest piece of that is to know who your students are and to know who your families are. So with this, in addition to once we have our culturally responsive identification and assessment, then we need to make sure, that we have culturally responsive programming. And so I'm not going to read every single piece on this Facebook page or on our slides, but I want to point out a couple of pieces in particular. One, project-based learning. Project-based learning that is real world, and authentic. That will be one of the pieces that helps to make it culturally responsive. Something in which our students are able to give back to their community or help our community. That we've got culturally relevant instructional practices. So some of you have read Culturally Responsive Teaching in the Brain. You may have read some of Dr. Castellanos' work, Dr. Ford's work. So really incorporating those pieces into our best practices with working with our Latinx learners. And then let's talk about talent development. So again, are we, and is our GT program one in which we are creating for students who have already demonstrated performance? Or is it about potential? Or does it serve both? And so it's really trying to figure out how do you nurture that talent? And social emotional learning. Social emotional learning coming from a very trauma-informed, culturally responsive lens. And when I say trauma-informed, I'm in no means insinuating that our Latinx learners are coming with trauma. But it's in this place of we're approaching all of our learners with a trauma-informed lens so that we're coming to the table in which we can heal, in which we are open and able to listen to what our learners need. And then culturally responsive programming strategies. So we talked about the social emotional learning, but then acceleration, our bibliotherapy with mirror and books, and we've got some resources for you at the end of this slide deck where you'll be able to get a plethora of books that may work for your classroom or for your own child. Enrichment opportunities, really layering in depth and complexity on top of the existing curriculum. Mentorships, we all know the research and the power behind that, and specifically with our Latinx learners, to be able to have someone in the community who looks like them and is able to lean in and to say, here, come with me, I'll help you. And then Michelle and I went back and forth on this a lot and how much to talk about this, and we do talk about it a little bit later in our book, but honoring heritage language. So how does our classroom honor heritage language? How do we give it that space? And what's our connection to the community? Is it that I'm going to the community and just telling them what they need? No, I need to go to the community and ask them what I need to know as a teacher. What do they value that I may be overlooking? And I have to acknowledge if I have a bias.
So we know that most kids who are nominated to go through the gifted process are nominated by educators, by teachers. So professional learning is very, very important, not only for teachers and educators in the classroom, but also for families. Many families do not know that there is a gifted process for their students, especially our Latinx kiddos. So we really need to have some type of professional learning for our general education teachers so that they know what the characteristics of gifted Latinx learners are, and they're able to recognize them. Rob and I actually created a gifted Latinx checklist. It's not normed. We have a checklist with all the characteristics that will help educators. Also administrators. Administrators need to know, what the demographics are in your school. Are your demographics matching for your gifted Latinx learners as opposed to your other students? It's great if you can get into a new teacher orientation right from the very beginning of the school year, have discussion about this, not just gifted, but also putting in cultural lens as well. And then also partnershiping with the district and the state. I know that today we were asked to help out with an ELD handbook. Actually, it's a gifted handbook, but ELD piece in there looking at what a profile looks like for a gifted Latinx learners. So I'm excited about partnering up with some of that work. Also just Robin and I are working, well, Robin's been doing it for a while in her district, but we're working on actually having internal certification. So you can get an internal certification for DT, but then one of the focuses on there is actually cultural linguistically diverse students is added on to that too as well. So that's a gifted, basically it's not an endorsement, but it's a certificate that you can use that has various classes that you take in to support the fact that you do know about gifted kids. And then for the family, being able to give professional development to them about what it looks like for a gifted Latinx learner, also being able to support them with book study groups with social emotional learning that helps them learn more about their student and how they can help support them at their school. So family and community engagement, this is a big part. The Latinx cultural, their community is very, they're very connected with each other. And so it is always a good idea to go out and be able to have a home visit with families and talk to them, not about academics necessarily, but about what their world is and how they live and what they like and what they do with their kids and what do they do outside of school, and just really getting to build a relationship, because with this population, it is about relationships. So that is really important to build with a family. We do have a family interview survey as well as student interviews that are in our book, and then also going out in the community, visiting the community members, going to the local Boys and Girls Club and talking with them about how these students are doing there. Or there's some that stand out more than others. Also, when you do professional development, providing it at local community areas instead of in the schools, but going actually out into the community.
And you know, Michelle, I've seen a big difference in change within Denver Public Schools when we started going out into the community versus always having the community come to us. That was very much a white privilege piece to our work, and that wasn't going to be culturally sustaining. You know, there's so many reasons why families do not want to come into a school building or don't want to come to a district, you know, location. And so by us going into the community, it's us saying, hey, we want to be a part of you, and trying to really start to dismantle the different, you know, preconceptions and systems of oppression that have been in place, and these invisible rules that we need to just change.
Absolutely. Well, speaking of change, so here's some of the things that you could do to take action in your school districts or wherever you're coming from, your state. So increase your use of body of evidence. Make sure you're not just using a cognitive catch to catch these kiddos, because honestly, the cognitive is really difficult to get on these kiddos, and there are a couple of them that we do use, which we're not talking about assessments today, so we won't go into that. But however, they're all outlined, and like I said in our book. Also just looking at portfolios and interviews with these kids, but also the big piece about this is that when we're looking at these kids with body of evidence, make sure that we're looking compared to native peers, not compared to the whole population, but compared to their native peers. So that's a really valuable piece. Also having a talent pool, talent development, so that you have a group of kids that you pulled, maybe they didn't make the criteria, but they're maybe 20 points or whatever, and put them into a group, give them advanced programming, give them advanced math. And we've seen these kids bubble up after they've been given advanced instruction. And then also just do research on cultural and linguistically diverse and what that looked like. There's so much research out there, and apply it to yourself. And what does it look like for you and your bias? We all have bias. So how can we all change our lens to really promote gift identification and programming for all students who have the potential? And then also develop an ELL cohort at your district level. Develop these people, we're looking at doing this actually high school level, developing some high school ELL cohort gifted teachers so that they know what these kids look like, they can help support them, they can help mentor them. There's lots of different possibilities and opportunities that you can do to make a change.
Well, and to think through, what is your position within the school district? What is your role, and how can you use that role and your position to empower and to change things, even if it's just in your school? How do you create that group of students and get their voices heard? You know, Michelle mentioned the talent development piece and giving that access. I have the opportunity to work with an amazing school in which that's what we did. We flipped the script and the narrative, and we said, we are going to teach as if all of our students are gifted at this school. And it's really because of this amazing principal that he and I got the chance to work together. And he had this idea and I had this idea, and it came together. And what we saw within 1 year of him teaching, but also providing the scaffolds and the supports, the language supports, the family engagement supports, every single score went up. Every single score. Our students in special education, are second language learners. And this is a really diverse school with both Somali, Spanish, and Vietnamese. So there's a lot of opportunity there, even with your own position and your own station.
Absolutely. So also other steps you can take, we have access here in our area where it determines language acquisition. So as assessment that's given. So look at your language acquisition assessments. Look at those kiddos who are demonstrating performance beyond their peers. If you're seeing a kiddo who's just come in, they're in first grade and they're not speaking very much English, and within 3 years they're fluent in English. And so look at those types of kiddos because that's a rapid language acquisition. Also, honoring biliteracy so that they're, honoring that the second language is Spanish. It's so often that I see kids who speak French and who come in speaking French or German or something, and then they learn English. And those kiddos are not looked at in the same lens as a kid who speaks Spanish and is learning English. So really we need to change our perspective on that. These are all English language learners, and Spanish is not a deficit language. The other thing too is that increased need for assessment tools. So in dual languages, like I talked about, language rapid acquisition, that rate of acquisition language. So yeah. So Robin, did you have anything to add?
Just with this, it's writing, it's talking to companies, sharing with them what we really need, and talking to them honestly about our population of learners that we have, and insisting and continuing to advocate for our learners, be they Somali students, be they Vietnamese students, be they Latinx learners, that they are incorporated into the norming populations. And it's being persistent, which Michelle and I have no problem doing. And so that leads to what policy recommendations or what practices need to be put in place at the national, state, and local level. And so when we start thinking about what needs to be done, one of the pieces that we've seen that I am fortunate enough to get to work with some amazing people in both Denver Public Schools, but in the state of Colorado. We have an opportunity to really start confronting white privilege. We need to do that at the national level. I know our National Association of Gifted Children is starting that. They have some amazing resources, and I'll talk about that in just a little bit, really pushing this and pushing back on our history within gifted education and how we've moved from more of an exclusive community to we are doing our darndest to be inclusive and to make sure that giftedness is seen and represented in every population and every demographic. We've also considered, how do you get bilingualism into the definition of giftedness? So can that be in your own district? Do you have that kind of control? Is it something you consider in your body of evidence? Or is it something that you can petition the state on? So at what level, how do we include bilingualism and expand our definition? And that work really comes from Valdez. That's not a Michelle and Robin original, but it's important. Then consider access scores. We've mentioned it a couple of times, but or if there's another assessment that your school district is using to measure language acquisition rate, you really think about incorporating that into your body of evidence and making it part of your district, if you have this opportunity, either part of your district policy in regards to identification or your own school district's practices or your own school's practices. And then how do you honor biliteracy? So creating, again, either policies or practices that promote biliteracy and the seal of biliteracy. Michelle, would you talk a little bit about that and what you've done in Boulder? And what you're working on in Boulder, I should say.
Yeah, so we have a biliteracy program in the high schools. So kids who have two languages can take this assessment, and it's called the Seal of Biliteracy. You can actually look it up online. I think it's a bigger organization, and with that, they actually earn it's like a certificate or diploma at the end of the graduation, which states that they have the Seal of Biliteracy from the state. So yeah, I think it's a really good program. I would just think about another recommendation I hope I can just remember it because it just went right out my head. I'm going to come back to it. Okay, go ahead, Robin.
Okay, interrupt me as soon as you remember.
Okay, I will, because I just had a good one. Right.
Okay. This is how we write too. So we know that there's the increased need for assessment tools in dual languages. I should also say, as part of those culturally responsive practices and assessment, we need to ensure that we either have our heritage language speakers, native language speakers giving assessments. You can work with the different publishers like Pearson or Houghton Mifflin or many others to talk about getting your directions translated, to work with them to see if you can have interpreters to go ahead and give assessments, knowing that there are some cultural differences within our languages and that sometimes there's just not a word for certain things, but then taking that into account within that margin of error. Looking at your HR policies, your recruiting policies for representation. This is something that we have been doing. We've started really trying to pick up speed, and then we've had a little bit of a setback with some of the things going on with the pandemic, and really just making sure that we've got moving in and being fluid with that, but really starting to have that conversation with HR about how do we recruit? Where do we recruit? And then making sure that we are working with our English language acquisition teachers or ESL teachers, depending on what they are called in your school district, that they understand the characteristics of a gifted second language learner, and also making sure that our gifted teachers understand the characteristics of a gifted second language learner so that they're really working in partnership.
Robin, I just remember I was thinking, the other recommendation would be for world languages to be added to your part of your phrase for identification.
Yes.
So that will allow for Spanish as well as other languages to be part of that biliteracy type of award with world languages. And then I was also thinking too that this pandemic actually gives us a really great opportunity to really expand our body of evidence and to expand the way that we identify kids who are gifted, because testing is going to be a challenge, and we might be looking more at a bigger portfolio for qualitative evidence. So I think that's really an opportunity for us at this time.
How many of you have seen the Bill of Rights for Gifted Students of Color? I hope that all of you who are on this tonight have seen that. It's linked in here, and when you're able to access this deck or this PowerPoint, you'll be able to get to that. But this is specifically around what our students of color have the right to have within gifted education programs, and it comes from the Bill of Rights for gifted students. But understanding that we have to center race in everything that we do so that we can make sure that no voice gets left behind. Speaking of centralizing race, you know, I'd be remiss to say that if we didn't dive in to really exploring the power of our words and our thoughts and the ways in which microaggressions and implicit bias poke through and peek out of our identification practices and policies and our perceptions of learners, I wouldn't be happy if I left this conversation without talking to you about that today. We've seen when we start talking about culture and identity and really starting with self, understanding one's own culture and identity, that we're able to start bridging any differences that we may have and building empathy to understand that there's value in other cultures. Now, this does not mean that we are explicitly thinking, oh, I don't value that culture or that language. That's the implicit bias. And so sometimes our implicit bias comes through statements. These are statements that Michelle and I have heard, some of you may have heard, and maybe some of you may have even said. And the key with this, there's no shame, there's no blaming in this, it's acknowledging it. We have to acknowledge this so that our students can be seen for the value they bring to the classroom. So some things we've heard is, you know, where are you from? Well, I was born here in Texas. No, but where are you from? You speak English very well, or really well. We've also heard, oh, so you got into that school? I directly heard this. My brother did well, but he's white, so he didn't get in. I mean, that's pretty overt. And of course you got a scholarship. And you can sub in Latinx for any marginalized population when it comes to these microaggressions. One of the things that Michelle said that she had heard is, like a teacher would say, I'm going to call John because Jose is too difficult for me to say.
Because just now I had my own microaggression that meaning to do so. Jose,
Michelle, you're a little quiet.
Sorry, Jose actually has an accent on the end that I didn't put in, Robin.
Oh, well, and unfortunately, then we need to make sure that we correct that before that gets additionally shared, because that's an unintended typo. So, and then I actually heard this. A principal was relaying a story to me about an interview that she had done with someone. And she asked the teacher how she would teach English language learners. Like, how could she do that? And I kid you not, Facebook family, the interviewee said, I would slow down and speak louder. Not only did she say this about our second language learners, primarily at this particular school, who are Latinx, but she said this to a principal who identifies as Latinx. Needless to say, she did not get the job. And I remember that principal, who's a really good friend of mine, saying it was all I could do that day to not come over the table. And again, that happened maybe 2 years ago, and that stuck with me. So if I think about my Latinx students, friends, brothers and sisters, colleagues, the power of those words and the microaggressions that they felt daily are still with them. For me, that was 2 years ago, and it was a blip in the timeline. For them, that's their daily experience. So how do we make sure that we are acknowledging microaggressions, confronting them, acknowledging them, and stating, okay, I can do differently next time. I can do better. Because like Maya Angelou said, you do the best you can until you know better. Then once you know better, you do better. So we want to make sure that we give you some resources when you're taking action and confronting white privilege, specifically to try to start tearing down some of those thoughts. And we've linked in, I'm sure some of you know, Teaching Tolerance. While I don't necessarily like, that I'm teaching tolerance, it's my own personal thing. This is an amazing site, especially for finding lessons and units around specific cultures. It's fantastic. We've included a Latinx author and literature list. So these are books written by Latinx authors, and then our mirror books, but they're also window books. And when I say window books, it's really important for us to remember that we don't just have Latinx learners in our schools. We have white learners who are also getting to take the opportunity to learn about somebody else's culture. We have African American learners who will be able to connect to a student that they see in a character they see in a Latinx book. So make sure that we're being broad, because the mirror book doesn't just help me if I'm a Latina, if I'm a Latinx learner. It's going to help my white fellow students and my Black fellow students. And then there's Beyond Heroes and Holidays. We need to go deep with culture. We can't just keep going to heroes, holidays, food. I know the people on this call know that. And then if you're interested in your own reading, your own journey, there's White Fragility. It's written by a white woman, and so it's gotten a lot of criticism that, sometimes we tend to we as white women who may be on the call only go towards books written by white women. So I also want to offer you Me and White Supremacy by Layla Said. She is fantastic, and it really talks about the culture of white supremacy. I'm not talking about the deep-rooted Southern pieces, but I'm more talking about that institutionalized racism. And I should say that the deep-rooted Southern pieces, as someone from the South, it's all over, including what Denver was founded on. So, but Me and White Supremacy is really talking about institutionalized racism and how to disrupt that.
Elizabeth, do you have any questions?
Yeah, we have some questions. Thank you so much, ladies, for sharing that. Someone wrote on Facebook, thank you for addressing the microaggression. It's a topic that needs to be talked about. We are going to start with some questions that members emailed in ahead of time. A few of them I think you addressed throughout the presentation. One of the big ones, and I think Raquel commented on this as well, not knowing that someone else asked about this. How do Latinx and Spanish-speaking families find out about GT programs? Is it through email, flyers? Does someone reach out? I think you addressed this through not only do we want them to come to our community, but we need to go into their community. Is there anything you want to highlight or speak specifically to how do we get these families to even know that these programs or identification exist and it might be something they want to be a part of?
I think
Well, do you want to talk about Boulder first and what you've done?
I mean, there are several ways. We have family liaisons, which are in our buildings.
Hey, Michelle, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, you can't hear me? I don't know
No.
what's going on with the sound. I apologize. We have family liaisons who are in our buildings, and these are in our Title I schools specifically. And so these are the people who are bilingual, and so they will call our parents individually and invite them to events. Everything is translated in our schools. It goes out to families. We have our teach to make home visits to families. And so we also have in our buildings GT presentations, which are also offered to families, but they're in Spanish as well. And also at the district level, we have that as well. We offer those to families, which we go into schools and present those in Spanish only, and then are translated into English about what gifted looks like in our district.
We have some similar structures and systems in place in Denver. So we are fortunate enough to have family liaisons. While they're not in every single building, they are in many of our buildings in Denver Public Schools. And so we can utilize our family liaisons who may already have developed a relationship to share about our universal assessment, any of our gifted education identification practices. We often have our letters will get sent through those means. So sometimes it gets hand delivered, sometimes it gets emailed, but really when we look at our communication, we make sure that we have, no matter what the language is, that we have it translated. We also ensure that we have interpreters with us. One time we hosted an event in which we went again into a Latinx community, although this one was at a school, it was pretty trusted by the community. And we went in and it was a Spanish speaking only event. And we did have, most of my team speaks English, I do speak some Spanish. And we had Spanish presenters talking about and asking, what do you need? Here's what we can share with you. Here's some resources. This is what giftedness looks like in our community. And what we did for our English-speaking families is we had an interpreter that was translating into English for them so that they could participate in that as well. We also make sure that we advertise on the website and that our website's accessible in Spanish as well. And then we make sure that we're doing multiple events throughout the year and that we always have that interpreter ready and able to go.
I think we also have in our school district a Latino Parent Advisory Board who communicates with the board and then also communicates with gifted and special ed and our family connections piece too as well. So we are involved with that board. And I think if you don't have one, a Latino Parent Advocacy Board, I think it's really been a really great asset to get some things moving in our district for our kids.
And it's also using, those community partners. So we have some really strong Latinx community partners. And so we have been, we actually have just started this piece out of like reaching out and talking to different community organizations. But specifically, there have been times when we've gone out and hand delivered some of those pieces to a barbershop, to the carniceria. So we'll take our information there into the community. And so I think what Michelle is saying is so key of if we're able to get the Latinx advisory group going, and that's another way to lean in and share that information. It's really building the community up so they can, it's a two-way street. I mean, we as educators need to know what our families need, and we need to be able to give them some tools to navigate this system.
I think that's great. And I think that's a theme that came across your entire presentation. It's really about community. Sometimes we in education tend to silo ourselves, but the more we reach out and connect, the better we can serve these students. Another question came in from a member ahead of today. It said, how can students of color, multilingual students be centered in GT programming? And they said, in our experience, Latinx students are bearing the burden alone in the classroom. So do you have ideas or thoughts around, okay, so maybe we've identified the student as gifted or we're getting them into gifted programming. How do we ensure that they don't feel like I don't belong here, I'm all alone, that connection piece to really feeling like a part of the community once they're there?
It's not good practice to have one gifted Latinx student in a classroom with not a native peer. It's just not good practice. So you really do want to be able to have them two or more if you're having a gifted flexible grouping type of group, but you don't want to have one by themselves, because you're absolutely right, Elizabeth, they will they'll feel like they don't belong because it's not their culture. Yeah, Robin, some thoughts on that?
The burden is huge, what you mentioned, and we've heard that in families. I heard a family who said, well, I don't want to put my child in the gifted program because that gifted program, he'll be the only one and he's going to lose his language. So I think that is a pretty big wake-up call to us as a community within gifted education to go back and re-examine those identification practices and protocols. And so if we are able to do like what Michelle was saying, where we do have more than one child who is identified, and we absolutely should, then clustering and putting together, we need to be careful that it doesn't look like we're just putting our students together because, oh, they're Latinx, so we just need to put them together. We would not do that. We need to make sure that we're grouping appropriately based on data and ability. And then let's say they are the only one in that class. Then that's where I think, and Michelle, tell me what you think about this, but that's where I think mentorships are really powerful and come in. And if there is maybe a Latinx learner in a grade above or a grade below even, depending on what the student tolerance level is for other gifted peers of different ages, then that would be another great connection to make.
I think all of it has to do with our creative thinking outside of the box and being flexible in how we do school, which we're all being put through to the test right now to be creative in education, and maybe that'll open up some new pathways. Another question that came in ahead of time, do you have ideas of how districts can recruit native language speakers to assess them for giftedness? I know if we have a universal screener, that can help because at a certain grade level, everyone's getting tested, but do you have ideas on how to get those kids that maybe it's a district that struggles with a universal screener, or they missed it with the universal screener? How do we assess them to identify them better?
What was the question? How do we find these kids to assess? Elizabeth, is that the question? How do we find these kids?
The question, as it was written, how are districts recruiting native language speakers to assess students?
Well, I do agree with the universal screening. I think that is a really important tool. And I also think that, if we're looking at 95 percentile as our identification piece, that what we do is we use starting at 80 and 80 to 94 to look at as either a talent development pool or to go to another type of assessment or to gather more information. And I know that Robin even goes slightly lower than that, which she can talk about. But I think doing that early on in kinder, the universal screening, and I think that's really a good practice. And then also I think in our Title I schools and our bilingual schools that we have, really recruiting teachers to really know what the characteristics look like. And so they're able to recognize who they are. These kids, I know that we have one school in our district that is really good at identifying kids. And I think there are about 45 kids identified in this school. About half of those are Latino, which does match the demographic, but the teachers have been doing this for years and really know what that gifted Latino student looks like.
I think that's great advice for all of our teachers. Need to know what the characteristics and behaviors of gifted students are and what they look like so that we're not missing it or thinking that they need a behavior plan or something of the like that can often be the result.
I think
go ahead.
Family, Elizabeth, I just wanted to add, again, our families. If we're able to work with our families to give them information about what characteristics look like in general, but then again, to hear from them so that we can say, oh, that can be incorporated here. So, or how can we bring that culture into the classroom, again, beyond, a holiday. So really inviting the family in, giving them the tools, because what happens is that families and communities start recognizing those components in children that are within their community. So we have in our Latinx community a much more collectivist community and society than we typically have in our Western current dominant culture group. And so rather than that individualistic culture we kind of sometimes keep to ourselves, making generalizations. Within our Latinx population, it's more about we're in this together, we watch out for each other, we take care of each other. And with that, I know in some of our neighborhoods in Denver, I know exactly where Luis's child is. He's over 2 houses down and, or wow, he's really kind of a smart aleck. Wow, he can come back with so many responses to me. Hey, I think you need to talk to your gifted teacher at the school because there's something there. So I really think bringing the family in too is critical.
That's so true because students show many different things outside of the school building that we may never see in the school building.
Yes, daycare providers. Yeah, all of that. Mm-hmm.
Awesome, thank you. We have a couple questions from Facebook that we're going to get to, and they seem to be centered around Denver public schools, but I think in general we can share information amongst districts. So this question, obviously funding this year for education is a little bit interesting for so many reasons. Someone asked, Laura Lee asked, could the funds freed up from removing the support services of the police from DPS be used to expand mentoring? And I don't know if you have information to answer that question, but what could we do for funding for these mentorships with our minority student groups that are GT? Or she also asked about, sorry, this is long, about the idea of pathways to college scholarships or options post K-12. So I think in general, it's a question about funding and then how do we use that to mentor and grow our students even beyond when they're with us.
So in our school district, like many other school districts around the country, they are starting to look at the idea of removing the funding for police and reallocating it over to mental health, psych social work, nursing services. And so through that, there is the potential that some of that funding could be used in that manner. It would be up to, of course, whatever the district wanted to do with that particular funding. I can tell you, Laura Lee, hi Laura Lee, that in Denver, it's currently going to be allocated for increased mental health time and potentially using that for increased nursing if there's enough funds. With that, and that's today. So I know that this is immortalized on the internet forever and know that there could be pieces actually change depending on what our funding continues to look like once we get through this, and we will get through this. And so then it's about, okay, then how do I mentor? How do I fund this when I have no money? I'm in a small rural district. What do I do? I'm in a big district, and they're cutting funding to us again. And so one of the things that we are fortunate enough to do is really rely on partnerships with different community organizations. Sometimes it's just us going out and asking, hey, we've got a student who is really interested in architecture. You are an architecture firm, and you specifically work within our Latinx community. Do you have time to do this? And a lot of times when you pull on the heartstrings of our community members, they are willing to do whatever is necessary to give back to their community. And so that's one way we can do that. In Denver Public Schools, we are lucky enough to work with an organization called Community Resources, Inc. And that particular organization, there is someone in there who goes out and finds volunteers and mentorships. And so there's one person that's dedicated to do that. That's a tangential organization, so it's not like I can go through and it's at so many kids and every kid in Denver Public Schools can do that. It's application based. And so what we're really trying to encourage is working with our schools at the local level to say, okay, so who are the leaders in your community, and how can we ask them to lean in? So that it's not just for those select few that we're able to get into that and have that application, but that we're trying to make it sustainable. Michelle and I talked about culturally sustainable practices. That's one of those things is really trying to give that power back to the school to engage their community. And then, and Michelle, I don't think, has Boulder talked about defunding? No? Yeah, okay. And so then with some of the scholarships, a lot of our schools in Denver and around the country do have opportunities where students could potentially earn an associate's degree by the time they leave. And so what's critical and what our particular department's been working on is vertical teaming. So understanding what is needed at that high school, high level advanced curriculum, what's needed there, and then start backwards planning down to elementary so that we not only can get our students into those programs, but that they stay in those programs. Because I can make a technical change very quickly, and I can say, oh, we are going to be an all international baccalaureate school. We are going to let every 10th grader take AP. If I haven't given that student the access to that level of material before, and I'm not properly scaffolding, then it's no wonder that we don't have those success rates. And again, let's think about the power of our words and our thoughts and the unintended consequences of that. I've put this student who very well could have scored and earned college credit or gone on to go into those programs to do concurrent enrollment. But what was the message I just sent to them when I didn't give them the educational supports to allow them to be able to truly access that? And so that's where, for those of us who are in central or have that position where we can really lean in and push on our leadership, those are the conversations we need to have. And I'm just really lucky and fortunate that I get to push that way.
That's awesome.
Michelle, did you have anything?
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing. We are almost out of time, and we have one more question that's specific to Denver Public Schools. And so I don't know that we have time to go into it here, but it's from a viewer right now on Facebook. Her name's Kelly, and she has a question about CDE data and gifted students, and maybe this is better anyway to have in an email conversation. So Kelly, if you're watching, we will pass your question along to Dr. Robin Greene, and you can, Kelly, if you'll email me, I can pass on your contact info at cogifted@gmail.com. That's our email here at CAGT. Do you have your book information, when it's coming out, the title of it, where we can get it? Is it out?
Michelle, lean in and be a little louder.
We have the title is Supporting Gifted ELLs and the Latinx Community. Practical Strategies for K through 12. So it'll be out next year. We're hoping April, and it's published with Routledge.
And in that, we make sure that we've given a lot of tools, reproducibles, things that can be used, and really talking about from that very specific concrete policy pieces to very specific practices within the classroom and how to develop that. We also talk through a culturally responsive professional learning. How do you start? Where do you start? And how do you start making sure that you're creating a space within yourself to be a culturally responsive, gifted educator?
Right. And the book is, Rob and I created a culturally responsive, gifted framework, which the book has those components in it. And then also there's a model that Robin's created, culturally responsive, gifted model that's in there too as well. There's lots of resources, case studies, I think things that will be very valuable for educators, and also not just specific to Latinx, although that is our focus. These are tools that could also be used for other demographics.
Well, and to be honest, some of those tools I am using within our African American community in Denver Public Schools. And, you know, I think the main pieces and the changes that go between the different communities really relies on the culture piece and how we approach work with our families. So
Awesome.
we're really excited.
Yeah, that's awesome. I couldn't even imagine co-authoring a book. That's a big deal. So again, the title is Supporting Gifted ELLs in the Latinx Community, Practical Strategies K-12. I don't know what teacher doesn't love frameworks and practical strategies that they can do and implement right away. So we'll definitely keep our eyes and ears out for that book next year. Thank you, ladies, so much for sharing this topic with us. I think it's needed in our gifted community, and we appreciate you sharing your thoughts and work with us. For all of those of you who are still on with us, next week for Conversations with CAGT, we have Julie Skolnick, who's actually one of our keynote speakers for conference this year. Again, yeah, it's going to be awesome. She will be presenting next week for Conversations with CAGT. The title of her presentation is The Importance of Communication on Social Emotional Engagement. So you'll want to join us for that. Again, if you want to register for our conference, you can go to our website, coloradogifted.org, and get early bird pricing right now before prices go up soon. Time flies by, and before you know it, early bird's over, so don't miss that. Thank you all for joining us, and we will see you next week.
Thank you, Elizabeth.